I'm the Vice President. The recording is in progress. Hello, everybody. I'm Karen Percy. I'm a co-vice president with the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance and a Walkleys director. I'm coming to you from the land of the Bunurong and Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation in Western Melbourne. We have tonight a great lineup for our fourth in our Code of Ethics series. We are looking at the section of the Code of Ethics that relates to not placing unnecessary emphasis on personal characteristics, including race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, age, sexual orientation, family relationships, religious belief, or physical or intellectual disability. This is the section 2 of the code, and we've got some top-notch speakers here who've got personal experience and a great deal of insight to offer into this area. So we're going to be discussing the relevance of these in reporting and how we better communicate to minority and disadvantaged communities, marginalised communities, and we're going to touch on the lack of media diversity in the Australian media sector. So we've got, as I say, a cracking lineup. We've got Beverley Wang, a journalist and co-host of Radio National's Stop Everything audio. Is it a podcast as well as live, or?
It's both. It's
yeah. So Beverley also created the It's a Race podcast, which looked at exactly these kinds of issues. She got her start in journalism reporting for newspapers and the Associated Press in the northeastern United States. She's from Vancouver in Canada and has been living in Australia here in Melbourne since 2009. Melissa Griffiths is a writer and freelance journalist as well as a transgender activist. She's not really coming to us from San Francisco. She's also in Melbourne. She's a consultant on diversity and inclusion, and her clients include various horse racing clubs, including the VRC. She's also based in Melbourne, bit of a Melbourne bent tonight. We've also got Kishor Napier-Raman, a federal politics reporter for Crikey, who's based in the Canberra Press Gallery. He writes news, analysis and opinion with a focus on foreign policy, legal affairs and government transparency. He'd previously been a general reporter at Crikey's Sydney office where he started in 2018 while completing an arts law degree at the University of Sydney. We're also going to be hearing from Elle Gibbs. She's a writer and disability activist. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Elle when we get closer to having her presentation, but I think you'll agree that we've got a really terrific lineup this morning. So as I've been doing with these Code of Ethics webinars, I start out putting our journalist contributors on the spot. The first question I'm going to ask is, how does the Code of Ethics guide you on a day-to-day basis? So Beverley, let's hear from you first.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, Karen, and hello to everybody who is tuning in. I think the Code of Ethics is like a backbone of probably all of our journalistic practice, and hopefully we have read it and internalized it to a point where it is like second nature to us. I also rely a lot on the ABC editorial policies, being the national broadcaster, and yeah, I think they're really important guiding principles.
Melissa, how does the Code of Ethics guide the work that you do?
Thank you for having me, Karen, and hello everyone. I guess it's just like a Bible, you could say, when you're writing, whether I'm doing the advocacy work or writing an article for even an online website. And like Beverley said, it just becomes second nature and you take it on board. So when you're doing any reporting or writing an article, you're doing it in a fair, honest way, and it's you're taking everyone's point of view on board. If you're interviewing someone or if you're writing an article, you're considering all of that, and it just becomes second nature.
Kishor, what's the role the ethics playing in your career?
Look, I think that as journalists, we've all got a kind of gut feeling about how to be reasonable and how to do the right thing, how to be scrupulous, how to be ethical. I think the good important thing about having a code of ethics is that sometimes our guts let us down, and it's good to have that sort of out there in writing as a kind of guideline that we can turn back to and something that can just make sure we keep on the right path, because often we don't necessarily always do that. And it's good to have that as a set of guiding principles to live by.
I'm going to ask each of you one by one, how would you rate on a scale of 0 to 10 the ethicalness of the Australian media? Kishor, you're up on the screen at the moment. Where do you rate us?
Oh, damn. I mean, I think that really is on the spot. I think the important thing to say here is that the Australian media is, well, diverse is probably the wrong word, but there are a lot of different outlets with very different editorial incentives and perhaps, different approaches to ethics. I think on the whole, most journalists would like to say that they do the right thing most of the time and would err towards the 10 end of the scale. But obviously, we would all like to think that we do the right thing all the time. I think, though, that often, when we're talking about things like, reporting on race issues, on gender and things like that, I think where the Australian media falls down is it simply just reflects its own blind spots and its lack of diversity. And while I don't think that always leads to unethical reporting, it creates a fertile ground where unethical reporting can happen. And so to the extent that you do see stuff that is bad, I'm sorry, I haven't rated the media at all and put a number on this.
No,
but,
you need to get on with it. Come on.
Just listening to politicians' questions all day.
Yeah.
Trying to avoid it. Look, I would say it would probably be about a 5 or a 6 maybe. And obviously that's an average. There are some people who are always at the 10. There are some people who are,
nowhere
at
near
the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, great. Melissa, what do you think? Where's your scale?
I'll put myself out on a limb and say we're about a 7 out of 10. I think, as it's just been said, like different organisations have different values and ethics. And I know, like with the National Inquiry into News Corp and their behaviour, obviously does bring it down. However, I think most journalists do have a sense of what's right and wrong in ethics. However, I know there is some blind spot, and being recently interviewed on Fox FM, I realised that still a lack of understanding around gender diverse issues, and some of the questions I got were quite interesting. And it was almost like it was loaded in terms of talking about the rapper who did a stunt, did a dead weight in reference to Laurel Hubbard and said, I identify as a woman. And I just said, it's just a stunt. So, and it just killed the conversation. I thought that question was unnecessary. So
we'll get more into that as well.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, we'll get into that. No, Beverley, where would you rate the ethicalness of Australian journalism?
Oh, you want me to put a number on it, hey?
I do.
That's a very difficult thing to answer. Karen, I think it's tricky because, like Kishor alluded to, it's not that it's diverse, but it's varied, right? So we have this interesting situation in Australia where we have a lack of diversity, as in racial, gender diversity, all of that, right? But the media organizations are varied, but also few. It's a real conundrum. And so it's hard to put one number to suit this entire industry, which is not a monolith, like everything like that just been referred to, like FM radio, to nonprofits that report the news. So I might just say somewhere between a 5 and a 7.
All right. Well, maybe that's a 6-ish. I have neglected to tell you all that Alan Clark's actually unable to join us this evening. He's had a last minute something or other come up, but he has promised that he's going to give us his presentation at some point. He's an Indigenous man and an investigative reporter, and we were very much looking forward to his presentation. So unfortunately, he's not going to be with us today, but we know it's still going to be a fantastic discussion, as we've already heard so far. So we're going to be hearing now from Elle Gibbs. Elle is an award-winning writer and a disability advocate who's worked in media and communications for close to 2 decades. She is a disabled person committed to ensuring that disabled people can tell their own stories. So now if we'll get Elle up on the camera, she's got 5 minutes to give us a bit of an idea of the kinds of challenges that people in the disability sector and disabled people find in dealing with the media, and hopefully some tips on what we can all be doing better. Thanks so much, Elle.
Thanks heaps, Karen. Thanks to everyone at MEAA and the Walkleys for having me, particularly Karen, and I'm really honoured to talk to you about tour today. I'm coming to you from unceded Wiradjuri country in central west New South Wales, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past and present. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm a disabled person, and I did actually train as a journalist a very long time ago, but I was told right from the get-go that there wasn't going to ever be anywhere for me and someone who looked like me in a newsroom. I kind of know that wasn't true now, but at the time it really discouraged me from trying to find a place for myself in journalism. So I went off into communications, and I've spent a lot of time working with journalists to try and report well on disabled people and on disability issues. So Karen asked me to think a bit about the part of the Code of Ethics that says to not place unnecessary emphasis on personal characteristics. And perhaps that doesn't really cover what it's needed to report well on disabled people. My disability isn't separate from who I am. It's why I talk about being a disabled person. And at the same time, being disabled is kind of routine, at least for us. And so talking about it as though disability is unusual or, God forbid, inspirational isn't also okay. So there are often stories that go into great detail about what disabled people can't do, or long medical histories when that has nothing really to do with the story, instead of a focus on the barriers that we face. And this is what's called the medical model of disability, as opposed to the social model of disability, which is what most disabled people kind of think about in the way we think about ourselves. And the medical model says that, you know, I'm disabled by my impairments, and that's what makes me a disabled person. But the social model says that I'm disabled by the world around me, not having the adjustments that I need to actually kind of function. So, for example, if I'm disabled by a flight of stairs, it's not actually because walking's hard, even though walking is hard, but it's because there's no lift or no ramp. And so this shifts disability from being about what's happening to individuals into the sort of wider social and political context. We've got a saying in the disability community called "nothing about us without us." And this came from the really long struggles that disabled people had many years before me to kind of take over the organisations that were speaking for us, and to kind of have a say about the decisions that are being made about our lives. For a long time, non-disabled people spoke for us and were seen as the experts in our lives. And to be honest, that's kind of still how things are. So all too often, disability service providers, parents and families, disability support workers all speak over us and for us. And of course, all of these groups have a perspective and a story to tell, but it's not ours. So one of the least favourite calls I get from journalists is for a so-called case study. And I know you've probably made those calls yourselves. I'm often asked for a very particular disabled person with very particular characteristics to illustrate a story about a policy issue or a call for action. And it's often that journalists already have a non-disabled expert lined up and to talk about the issue. And I often ask, why aren't we then seen as the experts? Why aren't we seen as the experts on these issues that are of importance to our lives, instead of actually only ever being there to talk about our individual experience? And often these requests for case studies can mean that disabled people are asked to talk about really hard stuff in an unsupported and sometimes really traumatic way. And it's really important that media takes really good care of people when they're asking them to tell their stories, particularly about violence and abuse. And this particularly matters in the context of the Disability Royal Commission. It's also really important that there's a diversity of disabled people in the media. All too often, disabled people like me, who are white, who communicate in really familiar ways and don't have an intellectual or cognitive disability, are the ones who get to talk. So if your list of disabled people that you go to are all white or all have a physical disability, you need to expand your list, and I'm really happy to help with that. We also have our own organisations who often have really specialised knowledge about particular groups of people with disability and kinds of disability. And so I'd urge you to get to know them. They often don't have media staff, they barely have comm staff, but persist because they are a wealth of knowledge. And I'll just finish with a few access points that if you're talking and interviewing a disabled person, a couple of things might make it a bit easier. Give questions in advance and in accessible formats. So if you have any questions about what accessible formats are, really happy to help. Talk to the disabled person, not their support worker and not their carer. Explain technical gear and the processes of the interview. That could be really helpful. And slow down. Give the person time. And I know that this can often really conflict with newsroom pressures and deadlines, and I don't have any answers to that, unfortunately. It's something that I've thought a lot about and talked a lot about with you and your colleagues, but don't really have any answers yet. But yeah, so thanks for having me, and I've sent Karen a bunch of links and resources, and really happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. And yes, please do put your questions in the chat. We will get to them. And I'm going to bring Elle back in a little later in our conversation so she can tell us a little more. But I'm going to now, I guess, start. I want to firstly explore a little bit about how much of a problem the reporting of personal characteristics or unnecessary or the wrong focus of personal characteristics is in our media. There's been some, we had pretty awful coverage of the Chinese population when the COVID pandemic first started out. We certainly had the notorious reporting of so-called African gangs here in Victoria as well. I guess, each of you, if you can give some examples of, what the impact of that kind of reporting can be on communities. Mel, let's go to you first, Melissa. What's the impact? There's certainly been a lot of discussion, in the transgender space at the moment, and a lot of information, misinformation, disinformation. What impact does it have when there is that kind of negative attitude and poor information out there?
Well, when it's out there like that, it means that people have the wrong perspective about trans people. And talking to older trans in my community, it's really hard to transition later in life. So it gives the wrong perception about people. We're still people too. We're just, for our own reasons, whatever it is, we're transitioning later in life. So it gives a totally wrong perception about us, and it creates this fear, as we would have seen through the same-sex marriage debate. Trans people got dragged into that about radical gender identity policies going to be introduced in our schools, which is totally wrong. So it creates all this fear and hatred in society, which is, and it was a horrible time for our community. And if you focus on that instead of focusing on the person, the story, the individual, why they're doing it, that maybe they're just trying to live their lives and be a better person, maybe there might be something a little bit inspirational and helpful to others as well. So it just creates unnecessary fear in society in general, and it's not helpful to anyone, and that's regardless of whether it's an issue around African gangs in Victoria, or if you focus on one minority part of society, sector, in a bad light, then if people see that, they may take that on board and think that's the norm when it's not.
Beverley, what kind of impact have you seen unnecessary reporting on, these kinds of characteristics? What experience have you had of that?
I'm actually going to drop 2 reports into the chat so that people can have a read. These are reports about Asian hate. One is Australia focused, and another one is from AAPI in the United States. I think they're good resources that give some quantitative background to the Stop Asian Hate movement and the rise in hate crimes towards Asian people during the pandemic. I think the issue is Well, I mean, the issue is racism. The impact of racism is harm, real world harm on people who are affected by racism. So to give you an example, a very concrete example, talking about race, you know, I have received death threats from people who have told me that, you know, I should die of COVID because they don't like what I have done in the media, and or that I'm a CCP sympathizer because they don't like what I tweet. Now, the funny thing is I'm Taiwanese. I come from a very pro-Taiwan independence family. So for someone to accuse me of being a CCP sympathizer, or even to say that I should die and get the China virus, you know, it doesn't matter that at a very nuanced, complex level of geopolitics and history, I don't identify as Chinese. It affects me because my last name looks a certain way and I look a certain way. And I'm a fairly empowered person. I work in the media. I know how to speak well. I'm privileged that way. But if you think about more vulnerable Asian people in the population, what's the effect on them? You know, and these reports that I've shared show that women are overwhelmingly targeted, and it's anything from being verbally harassed in the street, so something passing and fleeting, to, you know, being harassed online, to structural racism, you know, being denied opportunities. So the impact of putting undue identifiers when you're reporting is that all of these small details draw on embedded stereotypes, history, the massive structure of racism that surrounds us. And it's all picking on all of these. I don't actually like the term unconscious bias, because I think unconscious bias should just be called plainly racism, but it's drawing on what we will call unconscious bias and putting that in the form. You can see that from anything from reporting on real estate and, you know, Chinese investors, even though there probably have been no Chinese investors in Australia for a very long time, and house prices are going up, right? But look at the history of the way real estate and the rising house prices was reported for the last few years until this pandemic began. And you can actually see that it doesn't just reside in reporting on property, but all of these tentacles all build together. And the problem is that it creates hate, so that when there's a crisis, it's very easy to tap into that.
Kishor, what's your experience been? You've, you know, you're in politics now, but you've been a general reporter in Sydney. What's your experience been of this, of the kinds of reporting that leads to this kind of division?
Sure. I'm really glad Beverley brought up that example about anti-Asian hate, because frankly, I think the reporting around the China relationship with the last few years has been some of the most egregious examples of what we talk about when we talk about unethical reporting, frankly. And this isn't just a handful of outlets. This is kind of across the journalistic spectrum. We've developed this, you know, there's a tense geopolitical relationship between Australia and China, sure, but there is very much an obsession with espionage narratives, with stories about, you know, Chinese agents and foreign interference. And while some of those concerns are definitely legitimate and important, we've allowed a lot of that to be reported in a way where sort of the dots are often not really connected. And we rely, I think reporters maybe sometimes rely on people's existing biases to connect dots that aren't necessarily there. And you get an outcome where often Chinese Australians doing relatively innocent run-of-the-mill things are kind of couched in a negative light. They're treated as a fifth column. And you can see it in the really subtle ways a lot of stories are framed. So for example, you know, a story about Communist Party interference might be called China influence or something like that. You can see that in sort of the kind of imagery that surrounds a lot of these stories. And I think that what is important here is the context in which these stories are run has to be recognized. The context is that Australia has a very long history of anti-Asian racism, of this kind of existential fear about threat from the north. And so when a lot of these stories are run, it sort of taps into that, something that's quite latent here. And I think the second thing to note is that stories that, you know, disproportionately do impact certain minority groups, there's kind of like a flavor of the month in terms of what racial group becomes the one that gets targeted. If we recall, maybe, what was it, 5-6 years ago, when there was a lot of concern about, you know, ISIS or Daesh or whatever, there was a lot of reporting that disproportionately focused on the Islamic community too. And obviously that doesn't go away, but it's interesting to see how there are certain communities that become the sort of disproportionate focus of a lot of like really nasty scrutiny. And I think that often the journalistic defense is often, you know, we do have to run these stories, they're important. And I get that, but there's often just a really frankly, just a real lack of insight in what the impact of that reporting can be. And we've seen the numbers about more people in Australia having resentment towards people of Asian origin. We've seen sort of a reported rise in anti-Asian sort of incident, like racist incidents around the country. And, you know, you can't just blame COVID-19 for that, because the media is where a lot of people take their cues on such things.
Absolutely. Beverley, I'll come to you. Australian journalists traditionally don't like to be told that they're ignorant and don't know such things, you know, that their attitudes towards, you know, stereotypes, etc. Do you see any signs those attitudes are changing? We'll get you to unmute.
Classic Zoom error.
Absolutely.
I think, Karen, it goes back to my sort of waffly question to your first answer to your first question. It's media in Australia is varied, not diverse. And I think there are more conversations now. And I think there are actually more journalists of color working in Australia now than there have been in the past, and a lot of younger folks coming through the ranks. And I do think that in a lot of the larger organizations, there is a desire and a will to do better, to hire better, to be more critical and be more conscious of where the biases are. And there's more institutional openness to speaking about it. But at the same time that I say that, I'm also aware that there are news organizations out there who run campaigns, you know, to really, again, I'll come back to the real world harm, hurt people and demonize people. So it is mixed. I think that I have been part of lots of conversations about trying to make media better, but those conversations are also very tiring and can be very exhausting. And you often run into a point where you'll be told, yes, well, we want change, but our hands are tied and we don't have the resources. And so how can we make change without actually dismantling things? You can't polite your way to dismantling structures that actually block access and opportunity. So I think beyond words, there has to be real action. And I'm just looking more closely at this number 2 of the Code of Ethics. And it's really interesting to me because I think there's some subjectivity to not placing unnecessary emphasis. I think that is really open to interpretation. And if you're in a newsroom where it's predominantly one race, white people, I know there's a variation of existence and class and everything else to do with that, but let's face it, most newsrooms in Australia are white. Your understanding of what unnecessary emphasis is going to be different from what I think is unnecessary emphasis and what other members of this panel are. So I think maybe a good way to think about it is measure that unnecessary emphasis from the perspective of the most vulnerable person in that equation, the person or the party who has the most potential to be harmed by that. Measure that unnecessary emphasis from their perspective and let that be your guide, not from your perspective. If you don't understand their existence, try to put yourself in their shoes and then think about that.
That's really great advice. Melissa, I'm wondering, does your experience within, you know, as a member of a marginalised community, how does that inform the way you report and the work you do when perhaps dealing with other communities or some of the intersectionality that goes on? How does that help you to understand other communities?
Well, I think it helps me to especially understand other marginalised communities, because you've been through similar but different experiences of being marginalised, of feeling like you're not quite part of the community because you're a minority, or of who you are, or if you're disabled, you feel like society doesn't quite get you. So it helps you when you're dealing with someone that you can helps you to put yourself in their shoes, even though you can't totally do that. and it helps you have more empathy for that person as well. And looking at the code of ethics, you know that you can deal with them fairly and honestly and help them share the part of the story that they want to share, not necessarily what you may want to share, but it's more about them rather than you. And just putting that all together and so I know through my experiences that helps in that way, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Kishor, I'm just wondering, you're kind of in the mix in federal parliament where, we get a lot of the cues in our society at the moment. And, frankly, we see racism, we see sexism, we see homophobia and other discriminatory attitudes that are prevalent within our federal parliament. It used to be, it was at the edges, at the fringes, and it seems to be much more mainstream. They're overwhelmingly white, they're overwhelmingly male, they're overwhelmingly Christian, just like the press gallery to some degree. But how do you weigh up what to report and what not to report? When a federal minister comes out and says that Melburnians are frightened to go out on the streets because of African gangs, it's a federal minister saying something really inflammatory, but at the same time, it's a federal minister. What are the kinds of ethical considerations you would have in that kind of scenario?
Whoever might you be talking about there, Karen? Look, a couple of things to unpack here. The first starting point has got to be that, man, this building is so goddamn white. Like, I think I only realized the extent of that when I got in here, because obviously it's not just the politicians, it's the staffers, it's the press gallery, it's the whole kind of hubbub of activity. But yes, very white, very sort of privileged white sort of place. I think when it comes to how you deal with what a minister might have said, there is a tendency in journalism, and often particularly strangely enough in political journalism, maybe to kind of take something that a politician says and simply say it, sort of repeat it at face value. Now, sometimes doing that can be really important and instructive, because it often, you just sort of put out what someone said and they can sort of make a jackass of themselves and do the damage themselves. But I think often there is a problem in that when you do that, you kind of give that phrase a degree of weight and you don't challenge it. And I don't think it's necessarily being sort of biased or kind of bad as a journalist to kind of fact check something a politician says. But of course, when it is like the right time to do that, when it is the right time to say, this minister said this, here is the sort of data beneath that in the article, sort of the choice of when to do that is very much a kind of editorial call. I'm sort of getting into the minutiae of how you might write a news article, often under fierce deadline pressure. But the fact that, when you make the call to sort of challenge that statement and write the kind of put in the conflicting bit of evidence in the article is often very much a subjective one. And that's why it comes back to that issue of diversity in journalism, because I think that and I'm sort of broadly generalizing here, but I think a journalist of color is more likely to try to, or an editor of color, in fact, because editors are the ones making a lot of the big decisions, are more likely to push for someone when reporting that to sort of challenge the statement at the same time, if that makes sense. So I think the first part of the problem is the lack of diversity throughout our powerful institutions, because that is where phrases like that are able to be sort of said and go unchallenged. But I think the second part of that is a norm in journalism toward just kind of like trying to be as straight and unbalanced as possible. And I think that often comes up against difficulties when you are trying to report about things like issues around racism, around misogyny and that kind of thing.
Beverley, I'll bring you in and sort of, what tips would you have? We often have young reporters or wannabe reporters tune into these webinars, or they're picked up by their universities, etc. What advice would you give to a young reporter who's trying to navigate this at the moment?
Yeah, this makes me think about one of my first main reporting jobs when I was at the Associated Press. And at the Associated Press, there's, the famous style guide, which is the Bible of how you write copy there. And one of the entries, this is a long time ago, so I don't know if it's up to date, but the entry on race was pretty similar to the Code of Ethics, but it was, don't refer to someone's race unless it's necessary to identify them. So you might need to refer to someone's race because it's a missing persons report, and you need to say if they're Black, white, or Asian or Indigenous because people need to find them. So yeah, that makes sense. But I guess another example of when it would be unnecessary emphasis is recently during the European Cup, the championship, and that infamous Channel 7 social media post about the Black players, right? And it was a weird situation because the article was about the racism they were experiencing. But when you just saw the teaser in social media that said 3 Black players, that was like a red flag to racist. Just like, why did, and it said, I think, what was it? 3 Black players failed to at the penalty round, right? And so you're associating a failure, a flaw, something they've done, done wrong. I mean, I don't think that they did any, a team loses a game. We're just gonna become sports, but you know what I mean, right? And that was unnecessary emphasis because why did they have to write 3 Black players failed to do yada, 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 yada? That is inflammatory, unnecessary. So I think if that's helpful, it has to be necessary and it has to be contextualized. And ask somebody, don't just reside in your cone of silence of your journalism and be afraid for whatever reason to speak up and ask a question because you're afraid to look stupid or something like that. And then I think, but when you ask, it's a tricky thing because you want to ask somebody who's going to think about it and give you a measured response. Sometimes the people who get asked these questions the most are the people of color in the newsroom. And to a certain extent, yes, ask us, but also that's not actually what we're here to do. That's not what we're hired to do. And that can also be tiring. So it's a tricky thing. And I think, to bang that drum again, the problem is lack of diversity in newsrooms.
I'm going to bring Elle Gibbs back in here. Elle Gibbs back in here. So if you can turn your camera back on, Elle. I want to pick up on, we had a question from Fran in the audience about, there was one before Fran about descriptors. Now, I use the terminology disabled person rather than a person with a disability. And this is something that was talked about as, something that was told to young journalists to use. What's the protocol here? To me, it's about let's ask the person what they want, but that's not always possible. Or what can you tell us about the best way to approach that kind of thing?
Sure. So yeah, disability and language, one of my favourite things to talk about. So thank you all for such a fantastic conversation too. It's extraordinarily interesting and thoughtful. So generally, yes, ask disabled people how they would like to be, to refer to themselves and use those terminologies. Generally in Australia, we use people with disability in a kind of formal context. So government uses that. When I write submissions, I use that. But activists and advocates tend to talk about disabled people as ourselves, and some groups of disabled people very strongly use particular either identity first language or person first language. So autistic people will use identity first language, as will the capital D deaf community. Whereas say people with intellectual disability and often older people with disability very strongly have extremely strong feelings about using person first language. So I generally would use person first language, and then if you need to correct yourself, just use what terminology the person chooses.
Fran Malloy's always asking a great question, and you did make reference to this about those accessibility points in terms of the interview. So Fran's asking, what tips do you have for journalists interviewing someone with an intellectual disability who, you want to be sure they understand the implications of the interview, how the story is going to appear, etc. So she wants to get an idea of how you can prepare for something like that. And I think that's a really great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And hello, Fran. So I think the first thing is take your time. So take your time, build the relationships. And again, I understand that's not always possible, but I would go through self-advocacy organisations and peak organisations for people with intellectual disability, because they often have people with intellectual disability who are involved, who work there, who are involved in the governance of the organisation, who are then experienced media, who've done lots of media before, who understand the process and are familiar with what it looks like for them to actually appear on TV or to be in a story and know what that feels like and what that's like for them. So if you need something in a hurry, that would be my approach. But if you've got a little bit more time, then I would try and get the questions to be in easy read format, or at least one idea at a time. Easy read is a language that is often used for people with intellectual disability, but it's also really helpful for people with low literacy. So it's a form of language with pictures and words, but sort of one idea at a time, quite simple language. What else did I write down here? Being really clear around consent and taking time to make sure people do understand. I've done a lot of media training with people with intellectual disability, and it's something that comes up all the time. What will happen if I'm on television, and how will that mean? Because media always means television. So what will that mean, and what will it, who will hear it, and will it be around forever on the internet? Can I share it on Facebook? That kind of stuff. It's lots of questions, and having time for that is really helpful. But again, working with organisations that are run by people with intellectual disability can be really useful. There are lots of very, very experienced self-advocates out there who would be delighted to talk to you.
Brilliant, thank you, Elle. Kishor, I want to ask you, when is it appropriate to use personal characteristics? Because journalism is about descriptors and giving context. So how do you do it appropriately? How do you do it so that, one of the things that really strikes me is you read back in history and, we know that women were written out of history. We know that, people of colour have been written out of history. So many people other than white men have been written out of history. So how do you ensure that journalists in 100 years come back and kind of realise that there were other than white men in history? I've had this conversation with a cousin of mine, and I reference her as a gay cousin, and she gets upset about it, and I understand why, but it's just like, but I want you written in history. So help someone like me to navigate that as an older white woman who, I've had my, travails in the industry, but I'm one of these privileged people too. When is it appropriate?
Well, you've hit right on the tension there. There's no hard and fast rule about it, because there are instances where, like Beverley flags before, where there might be sort of reason to report on those things. But then I think the other deeper question here is that there is a tension with these communities, that we're talking about, by no means monolithic in how they want to be represented in the media, in how their relationship with the media might have been in the past, and kind of their relationship and understanding with with forms of oppression, for want of a better term. So there might be some people that find the concept of being defined as sort of the first Asian Australian person to achieve a certain thing like quite inspiring, and feel that is a really important part of their identity and part of their achievement and part of their success and story in life. There might be other people in other contexts where sort of singling that out might sort of reinforces harmful characteristics. They might feel like they're being tokenized and that kind of thing. I think the important thing to note here then is that, given that it is often quite a subjective call, the best way to do that is to sort of open your mind and your ears and listen to people. So, if that person is the subject of your story, it's worth just making sure you speak to them and clarify sort of how they want to be referred to. But I think like the second point then just goes back to something all of us have been hammering around a lot, which is that, if the Australian media landscape were to be more diverse, if you were to have more people in sort of newsroom leadership roles who did come from various marginalized backgrounds, who did have a kind of understanding of this stuff, I think you would get kind of more nuance around it, purely by virtue of more people being able to kind of relate to and understand the sort of nuances behind that. So to kind of synthesize a long answer, it's difficult and it's not subjective, but I think if you go into any piece of reporting with a bit of humility, I think you're less likely to make mistakes. And even if you do, because people do make mistakes, especially young reporters and that kind of thing, and identity can be a minefield for everyone. If you come into it with humility, people will be forgiving mostly.
Melissa, what's the advice you would give to people coming and wanting to report on the trans community? What's the best way to approach the issues that you deal with in your community?
I think maybe do some research first before they interview, whether it's me or someone else in the community. Maybe find out a bit about them. If they're working for an organisation, talk to that organisation as well. So do a bit of background research if you've got the time to understand pronouns, understand some of the issues and challenges we face before interviewing someone. And when you're interviewing someone like myself, as Marcus touched on, be humble. Like, if someone makes a mistake, most people, if you're vulnerable, will forgive you, and it's just out of maybe ignorance, or they just haven't come across it for just whatever reason. So it's just the way you approach it, and just be empathetic towards that person's story, because everyone's story is different, and someone like myself just wants to share the story to make it easier for people in the community that are having a hard time and don't get much media coverage, or it's very sporadic, and there's only really like Kate McGregor on Sky News and that's it. So there is once again a lack of diversity in the media for the trans community, and we're still obviously got a long way to go for society to understand us and accept us. So I think for younger reporters, just keep those things in mind.
Great. Beverley, I'll come to you. This is a question from Awa Mumtazian. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Awa. What role can effective, respectful and inclusive reporting have on strengthening social cohesion in Australia and overall appreciating each other's common humanity?
I think definitely it can have a positive impact. You know, the media is so influential. If we have more inclusive reporting, then that will have an influential impact. Just thinking about reporting and how to do better on that front, just to follow up on things that Melissa and Kishor have said, I think, and also Elle, if you're a journalist and you're covering, a range of stories, maybe just have a think and an audit back to who you have interviewed for which types of stories. Who are the case studies that you rely on for a budget story, for example? How do you frame and characterize, the typical winners and losers story in a budget story? What kind of family are you going to? Are you continuously going to ask a middle-class white family? Because then that becomes the typical Australian family. If you look at census data, a typical Australian family probably has someone born overseas. It's a very common thing. But if we in the media continuously profile and pigeonhole what types of people we put in what types of story, that does the opposite of the person's question. That erodes social cohesion. So have a think about, when was the last time you featured an East Asian person in a news story? Was it, your annual Chinese New Year story? Was that the last time you did that? Or did you talk to them about the budget? Or, when was the last time you spoke to an Aboriginal person when it was not a tragic story or an inspiring story? Same, when was the last time you spoke to a disabled person about whether they're a winner or a loser in your budget story, right? So if you are more conscious of that, that is going to have a transformative effect on the stories, the way people perceive the stories, the way they're received, the way, that actually feeds exactly into the answer to that question.
Absolutely. I'll put this to you, Kishor, then. I agree. I think that's one of the important things, is that we tend to kind of have these little pigeonholes. I will only speak to disabled people about disabled issues. We'll only talk to Asian people about, whereas, we should be asking everybody and anybody about superannuation and what do they think about same-sex marriage, and all of this, the issues that affect our community should be asked of all of these communities. What stops us? Why don't we? What is a natural thing to do? Why aren't we asking Indigenous people what they think about not just housing policy and the policies that affect them, but all manner of other things? What stops us?
I think it's good that Beverley brought in that example about the budget, because I think that there is just literally a kind of baked in understanding of what the sort of sort of normal standard Australian experience is, and that is a white family in the suburbs. And you can see that in not just media, but even, you know, how politicians have spoken about things like the COVID-19 crisis, you know, where they talk about definitions of family and that kind of thing, which is causing a lot of difficulty with like clamping down on gatherings in southwestern Sydney. They have this like very stereotypically white, for want of a better term, Western conception of what the family unit looks like. And that's digressing a little bit, but I think that perhaps there's an overwhelming sort of sense of what is the normal means that we sort of implicitly view people that are outside that norm as outside that. And we don't go to them for sort of so-called normal stories. We go to them only for things that we think are sort of, you know, things that are specifically about that community. So we go to them for the tragic sort of stories. We go to them for sort of stories that are, stories that are specifically outside that community. I think the upshot of that is that we, as a sort of media, tend to miss things and tend to sort of lose nuance on certain issues. The pandemic is a classic example of that. That example I brought about sort of the diverse experiences of family is something that not just, politicians and health experts struggle with. It's something the media has sort of struggled to articulate and can't really grapple with particularly well. And I think that when we start to kind of try to interrogate and sort of check our own conceptions of what is normality, that's when we can start to move beyond that. And I think that that process of self-interrogation perhaps doesn't always happen in newsrooms that much. There's some really interesting work that's happening in the United States where you've got big newspapers sort of coming out and trying to confront their past histories of sort of racialized and problematic reporting. I think the LA Times did something like that last year, kind of after the Black Lives Matter protests. And it was astonishing to see that level of self-awareness. I've never seen that from a single news outlet in this country. And we're not going to get good reporting on these issues until outlets start to do things like that.
As Beverley's pointed out, and I've seen it sort of over the 30-odd years I've been in journalism, there has been a real effort to try and bring diverse, inclusive candidates and staff into news organisations. What do you think are the supports that need to, but they, you know, so often there's a churn and burn for people. There just aren't the kinds of supports that are needed. Melissa, what do you think? What would be needed to ensure that trans and non-binary journalists would be able to be safe in the news environment?
Well, I think it's important that they know there's policies around gender diverse people in the workplace. They know that they actually will be respected by people for them as a journalist, not for them being, they're not like the token person who's gender diverse or non-binary or transgender. And that's really important for someone to feel comfortable in the workplace and know if they go work somewhere, like whether it's ABC or another news organisation, that they know that they've worked really hard at RMIT or wherever they've done their study to get their journalism degree, and they know that they're going to be respected for their work and it's going to be valued and based on that and not who they are. And that's may seem a simple thing to a lot of people, but it's really important. And I've found that through my working life. Because we're a minority, people still don't quite understand gender diverse people. There's still that overt sort of behaviour sometimes where people may feel comfortable around you. So it's important that the organisation does things to overcome that. So when someone comes into the organisation, they can concentrate on being a journalist rather than worrying about what people are saying to them in the workplace.
Anything you can add to that, Beverley, the kinds of mechanisms that can be in place? You made reference earlier to, I think we see it in our Indigenous community a lot as well, the burden of having to actually educate people. What kind of mechanisms can be put in place in news organisations and in the industry more generally to support and be more inclusive?
That is a very big question.
And we've only got 6 minutes left.
What can we do better? Well, I think one of the main things is we can do better at recruiting, and we can do better at retaining, and we can do better at providing pathways. Journalism is like so many industries now across the board where there's increased casualization, more contract work, less ongoing job security. And I think that takes a toll on people trying to get into this industry. First of all, you're going into an industry where you may not feel welcome because you're one of only a few. Second of all, you're kind of thrown scraps, casual shifts, and you got to hang in there. And what is the hope of being taken on to have job security, which is something that we all need. So I think these pathways are really, really important. I think managers, recruiters, people in charge need to do better and try harder to find good candidates. We are out there, we are many, but are we made to feel welcome? Are we given a pathway in? And when we're given a pathway in, how are we supported? And how are we not gaslit and made to feel that maybe we're there because we're a token, or gaslit as in our skills are called into question because of that. So there's a lot of work to be done. It's possible, but in order to achieve that, there's going to be discomfort and there's going to be shifts. And people may not be willing to make themselves uncomfortable in order to make others more comfortable.
Kishor, I want to come to you next. When I first came into the industry, the ABC was recruiting a lot of women, and but it was still very, 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 very male dominated then. And we were, I didn't want to cover the women's issues. I wanted to be one of the blokes, and it was like, you do it our way, it's our way or the highway. And I kind of regret, I think, like a lot of women of my era, having acquiesced to that for so long, because there is, it's not just about the look of the people in your newsroom. It's actually, if you truly want diversity and inclusion, you actually want their perspectives. How do you encourage that within news organisations that aren't used to that kind of thing?
Well, that's the big question here, isn't it? I think Beverley put it all very well, but I think to add to that, the real change can't really come on from the people who are fighting for scraps at the bottom and fighting for casualized jobs to kind of make it in. It has to come from management. And frankly, there are a lot of managers and editors and whatnot in this country who don't really take issues around diversity particularly seriously. I think they think that might deep down suspect it's some woke nonsense. But really, you just have to look at what newsrooms look like in comparable multicultural Western countries like the US and the UK and Canada and New Zealand, I think, to kind of get a grasp of how really, really backward we are on these things. I don't really know how to change that, but I think that that point you made, Karen, about people's perspectives really mattering and being important is a critical one. Because I think that at their core, most people in the industry just want to be doing good news and telling good stories. And I think that one of the ways, at least, to make a case for change is to just convince people that they're not telling very good stories if their journalists don't reflect the entirety of the population. You'll get better yarns if you diversify your workforce, and like that much should be obvious. And if we make that obvious, then we'll start to see change. And I think that where change is happening is because, people are starting to realize that.
Yeah, fantastic. Elle Gibbs, can you just give us a very quick wrap up of what you would like to see in the media sector to better reflect your community?
Oh, look, hi, disabled journalists. I think, people like Naz Campanella show what can be done and the kind of stories that disabled journalists can tell that are creating enormous change. And she's doing, an amazing job. But also talk to us about lots of things, not just the NDIS, not just about being disabled. As everyone said, we have lots of perspectives on things, particularly the pandemic, all of that kind of stuff. Disabled people have a lot of concerns about the vaccines. We have lots of issues that don't get talked about very often, but also be aware of the different level of resources that organisations have to actually be able to engage with the media and be able to put up slick spokespeople and package stories, and even media releases is out of the reach of lots of organisations. So I think being aware of that and giving people a little bit more time to actually put into the stories is always good, and I'm always happy to help.
Fantastic. I'm going to leave the last word with Elle Gibbs. She's an award-winning writer and disability advocate who's worked in media and communications for 2 decades. Thank you so much, Elle. Thank you also to Beverley Wang, who is a journalist and co-host of the Radio National podcast and audio program Stop Everything. Melissa Griffiths is a writer and freelance journalist as well as a transgender activist. Kishor Napier-Raman is a federal politics reporter from Crikey. I thank you all. This was a fantastic discussion. I really appreciate how honest and frank you've all been about it. We've got a long way to go on this. I want to thank the Walkleys for putting on these ethics webinars. I want to thank MEAA for putting on these ethics webinars. We have another, the 5th and final in our series will be on August the 26th. That's between 5:30 and 6:30 again. That's looking at, I guess, kind of reflecting back over these past 4 webinars, looking at the overall issues of integrity and accountability. You know, what might need improving in the code of ethics, what needs to be done to rebuild trust, how do we put the public back into the public interest. And the speakers, we've got another cracking lineup there. Peter Grester is going to be joining us. Sumaya Elambi from The Age will be joining us. Saffron Howden, she's now with Australian Community Media, she'll be joining us. And Elias Klur, a really terrific young journalist from the ABC. So that's another cracking webinar that we'll have in a month's time. But thank you everybody for your terrific questions tonight. And please do put a virtual hand together for our fabulous guests. See you next time.
Bye. Thank you.